Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the second of these short podcasts, which introduce and then conclude the NERC Social Science Training Edinburgh. This is John Sturzaker speaking. So in this part 2A short podcast, we'll be looking at defining the scope of a social science project and considering how how we might bring social and physical and natural sciences together. So this is perhaps the traditional way that physical, natural, and social sciences might have been placed together. So this is a kind of classic planning type project that myself and Ian have been involved with in the past. So you might start here on the left, identifying a physical or a natural problem, for instance, surface water runoff, and saying, right, how do we solve this problem? We need an engineering, a hard solution to this, such as SUDS, sustainable urban drainage systems. And then you then might bring in some social scientists just at the end to say, right, this is what we want to do. How do we do this? How do we deliver it through social science, through things like planning policies, for example? That's again the kind of classic model. Something which might be a bit better, and this is a form for a project I'm currently developing with the EPSRC, is to try and have physical and social science working together in a more iterative way. Due to the constraints of PowerPoint, we've got the arrows going between these things. These really should be, double-sided arrows, I suppose. Here's where you might identify a physical problem. Let's say it was surface water runoff again, and then rather than going straight to the stage of developing your engineering-based solutions, you test some assumptions. You work with policymakers, you work with stakeholders, and say, all right, well, this is a problem, and what's causing this problem? Is it what we think it is? Is it something else? What are the different contributors to whatever this problem is? Once you've worked out, once you've tested that you understand what is causing the problem, you then consider a wide range of solutions that might be physical, might be engineering based, or they might be something entirely different. It might be there might be other ways that you can address these problems that are equally legitimate and equally effective. So you develop your solutions together, and then you would test them together in a multidisciplinary way, in an iterative way, going back to the drawing board, as it were, going back and forward, testing things with stakeholders as necessary to try and come up with a solution which is integrative and holistic and has and it has involved testing at every stage. So hopefully you don't end up with something bolted on in a physical environment which doesn't work as you hoped it would. Here's a example of a project which was hopefully more in that latter approach. This was a project I worked on, an FP7, a European Union funded project called SUMI. We've got to have an acronym, obviously, in a European Union project, and this was Sustainable Urban Metabolism for Europe. And urban metabolism is a concept that you may or may not be familiar with. It treats urban areas as a living, uses the analogy of a living thing, and says that you have inputs going in and outputs coming out in the form of waste and so on. So how do you make that mechanism, that living thing, work more effectively and efficiently? So we had 4 work packages in this one, and I was working at Newcastle University at the time on work package 4, which was the looking at how you would transform urban planning policies and strategies. But the other 3, some of those were physical, some of those were social science. We worked together, we entwined as we went through to try and basically move or come up with ways that we might move how cities function in a more sustainable direction, using less energy and fewer resources. And this next slide is also from SUMI. So this is a sort of bafflingly complex way we devised to try and just sort of illustrate that the built environment, which is this bit in the middle in the red box, that's the bit that we see, so, the urban form. Some of it you perhaps don't see, flows of waste, energy, water and air. But to get to that bit in the middle, you've got complex patterns all around it in terms of the production of the environment with structures and mechanisms such as rules and regulations and planning systems. Lots of actors and institutions who form the built environment. It's not done by a sort of monolithic central state in most places now. It's done as a result of collaborations between the private sector, between landowners, between investors, and so on. And then on the consumption side, we've got the sort of pure consumption, if you like, the flows of waste, energy, water, and air. But shaping that are equally complex sets of structures and mechanisms, interests and values about where we like to live. So in the UK, for instance, many people want to live in suburban areas or in the countryside, have a lot of greenery around them at a fairly low density, unlike on some areas in mainland Europe, for example. So that kind of guides what happens, and then that guides then what actors and institutions like households and businesses do. So it's just to illustrate, how complex these things are and how difficult it can be to do what might look on the surface relatively straightforward thing, like reduce the amount of energy used in a city. And there's loads and loads of different things you need to be aware of if you're trying to do that. So now I think we move on to some slides for Ian.
And I think that's a really important point, because to understand the complexity of a phenomena, we have to think about what we're going to try and investigate. And this brings us to those very, very central questions of what are we looking at, why are we looking at it, and how are we going to go about investigating these things. To understand the complexity of social phenomena, particularly in social science, then we have to really go back to first principles and think about what are the key issues or questions that we're going to identify and then investigate. So what phenomena is out there which is deemed to be important enough for us to actually spend time thinking about it and generating a research project. This can be quite a complex process within the social sciences. We have to be able to look at the different variables which are socially constructed, physically constructed, politically constructed, or ecologically constructed, and work out which of those might be the most important for the project which we're proposing. So setting the baseline variables, understanding the phenomena, and generating a set of key questions is very, very important to the framing and then taking the project forward, because I think we all know that bad research questions lead to bad research. And that's particularly the case in social sciences, where the variation or the vagueness or the complexity of variables looking at can actually have quite dramatic impacts on what we're doing. And linked to this, of course, is the need to understand what the potential limitations are of any study that we're putting together. And I think we're all aware that we're all under incredible time constraints. We don't necessarily have the money or the relevant people or capacity to do a project. And these are sort of some of the things that we can think about when we're developing a project proposal. But we also need to link that directly to the development of the focus of the project and what sort of data we might be able to generate. And that's where the social sciences really come into this, because the ability to generate data from a number of different sources and a number of different methods from the methodological toolbox that John already talked about is quite an important and exciting part of the social sciences. And because of that, it can take you in very, very unique or different direction to what you're already used to. And so that's sort of the how question comes into play there quite a lot. But within that, we also have to think about our own positionality as a researcher, as an institution, or as a discipline. And I think we all understand that whether we're a social scientist, a natural or physical scientist, we have a set of techniques, methods, and assumptions which we use as a baseline for how we interpret the world or the phenomena we're investigating. And that's increasingly important within the social sciences, where we start to look at different theoretical positions as well, or ideological positions, which we'll come back to on the day. But as long as we're aware of why we're using a certain method and what it might mean for our data collection, we can see that actually there's a progression that's logical and that's rigorous within our studies and our approaches to investigation. And within this, we have to really think about why we want to use social science methods and techniques to investigate an issue. And this is really what the whole day is about. You're all NERC funded and you're all interested in potentially using some of the the techniques that are very common in social sciences to help you explore new avenues or create different data sets for your own research. And I think we all have to reflect quite extensively on what value that adds to what we're doing. We all know that research councils want these things in many journals. They're now looking for that mixed methods approaches. But we shouldn't just do social sciences because we think it might just tick a box. We have to think a bit more in detail about what value it will add to what we're doing. And within this, we have to really consider how we locate our research within the social science literature and practice. So again, things that we're all fundamentally aware of when we are undertaking research, what's already out there, what's being published in the academy, and what's available in a policy or public context, because this could shape how we approach an idea. It could identify a research gap for us, and we'd hope that our work would complement or add new information to a debate. And again, it's a little bit like going back to your PhD. What's your contribution to the knowledge of the academy? And social sciences might offer you different approaches to be able to fill those gaps, or to use a different technique or method to try and generate additional or supplementary information to help you address some of these issues. And part of that is to try and make your work stand out. And again, this is linked to REF, it's linked to our own jobs and our promotions, that we want 4-star papers, our institutions want 4 3-star REF papers. And we also want to show that our research actually is methodologically, conceptually, and analytically rigorous. And by using some of these different techniques, we can start to provide something additional which takes it beyond the individual discipline into something that's a bit more visible and widely cited or used. And part of this is to ensure that your voice and your work is actually out there, and that people are aware of what's going on. And again, this draws on the use of different methods, different kinds of data, and in many ways, social science is about engagement with the stakeholders who might take your work forward. So it takes it out of the lab and puts it into a real world context that we've already talked about. So how do politicians, how do local communities, how do businesses engage with your work, and what value can they find with it? And that can be quite a difficult thing to wrestle with, because we're never quite sure what we might find in social sciences, although we might have a good idea of what's going on. But we then have to try and translate that into terminology and language and data that people can engage with. And so potentially one of the largest differences between the natural and physical sciences and social sciences is that the data and the evidence that you produce might only be very, very incremental in terms of how it develops the argument further. And it may not get noticed because it just adds to something. So one thing that we think social science can offer for natural scientists is that it can help you sell your story and sell the evidence in a more visible way. And one example that I've worked on with this is a project called Value, so Value and Attractive Landscapes in the Urban Economy, funded by the EU via Interreg project. And this looked at bringing together stakeholders from the UK, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands to attribute economic values to urban green spaces. Now, the people who worked on this project were drawn from local planning authorities, from local government. They were engineers, they were ecologists, they were social scientists, they were planners, and they all had an extensive understanding of the value of their particular discipline. And the benefit of the Value project was to bring all that evidence together, to bring all those different techniques and methods that they could use to generate data into one project, to try and find out whether we could translate interventions or translate ideas from the UK to Germany, or from Germany to the Netherlands. And part of this was to look at the literature and work out what had been done before, and where this project actually add new information and new data. And the outcomes were that it produced a quite robust set of both qualitative and quantitative data, which has been used by politicians in the UK and Germany. It's been used by community groups in Belgium and the Netherlands to actually rethink how they invest in some of their urban landscapes. So there's quite a clear government and policy mandate that came out of this, because it was drawn from quite robust quantitative and qualitative evidence. But it also engaged a lot of different people across these 4 countries, who then took the ideas further forward. And that was because it utilised some of the more ecological natural science techniques, and some more social science work. And so the outcomes that we're trying to generate can be quite variable depending on what the project is, how we set it out, and what variables we're looking at. But invariably, we are moving towards the need to address an academic audience, a political audience, and a public audience. And this is something which I think we've all been guilty of maybe sort of taking a step back from in some cases, to focus on the academic audience or the science audience. But when we start to bring these together, we can start to see how our research actually talks to these audiences in different ways, and how it can actually promote an academic debate within a government or a local community environment. So it becomes potentially more worthy, rather than just being a scientific endeavour for the sake of it. We also start to engage more people with a range of methods, data collection and analysis, and start to engage people with the outcomes. So people are seeing that they might be part of the solution, rather than just being informed of the solution. And part of this could be a way of doing something new or something snazzy. So how do we make our research really visible? But some of it's also about how we engage with those people making decisions. And that could be NERC, that could be the other research councils, it could be local government, it could be industry, and how our research might actually talk to them in terms of changing their working practices or behaviour. And part of that is to sell the story that goes beyond the simple "here is the science" to "here's how it actually might affect your procedures or your production of certain products." So that can be quite an interesting way of generating visibility and buy-in for the outcomes. And finally, of course, there is always a need within social science to try and influence or change policy through a discussion of the evidence that you generate. And that can be quite a long-term process, because I think we all admit that politicians take a long time to do anything, because they require very robust evidence. So the more we can engage with these communities, the more we can actually talk their language and present information which they find valuable, is a way that we can actually start to generate visibility and impact for our research. So that's been a very brief overview of some of the key ideas about scoping a project. We'll take another break now, and we'll come back with the next section in a moment.